but even a quick look through the discographies of older groups suggests a noticeably different landscape. Full albums were more common, track lists were longer, and releases tended to have more longevity before the next comeback. At one point, it appears to have been relatively normal for groups to spend more time developing the rest of the album. B-sides obviously weren't the central focus of promotions, but they were clearly treated as a meaningful part of the project rather than supplementary filler. So then the question becomes obvious. Why did the industry start treating them like they are? The importance of B-sides in K-pop is complicated. On one hand, B-sides can give groups space to explore themes, sounds, and sides of themselves that wouldn't fit in a group's fixed concept. On the other hand, that exploration is still limited to what the company's plans are. Unless idols are directly involved in producing their music, they usually have little control over their musical direction, which means many of the songs they perform may not reflect what they would personally choose. On one hand, B-sides serve to flesh out a project. Whether a group is building lore, developing a concept, experimenting with different sounds, or simply assembling songs that fit together, the goal is to create a body of work that is meant to be experienced as a whole. On the other hand, K-pop companies are increasingly losing the art of the track list. Well-constructed albums still exist, but are rare. More often nowadays, when you open the album attached to the catchy title track you just saw on a music show, you'll find maybe 4 additional songs, 2 of which are sped-up versions. On one hand, B-sides can be a way to showcase an idol's artistry. Title tracks today are almost required to be catchy and trend-adjacent to gain attraction in an industry that is already saturated. B-sides allow for songs to be slower, stranger, or just less algorithm-friendly in general. On the other hand, almost no one outside of the fandom listens to them. That creates a situation where the title tracks become the only songs that meaningfully shape public discussions about an idol's music quality or depth. On one hand, there are legitimate cases where B-sides matter. Some are fan favorites, or even sleeper hits. They can explode into popularity even years later because they are genuinely just that good. On the other hand, those cases are the exception, not the rule. Most B-sides exist in a strange middle ground, distinct enough for fans to latch onto, but too culturally invisible to meaningfully affect a group's image or reputation. So yeah, the importance of B-sides in K-pop is complicated. Which is exactly why I made that passing comment in my last video about title tracks being the only songs that matter. If I let myself, I could truly go back and forth trying to accurately assess where B-sides lie on the spectrum of influence and significance, but it wouldn't change the original conclusion I'd already drawn. Whether B-sides are higher or lower on their scale doesn't change the fact that title tracks undoubtedly outshine them. But shockingly, I don't think this is an industry-pushed standard. I know I have a propensity to blame such phenomena on the companies behind the machine, and I would be right 90% of the time. But I actually think it's the other way around. Take this with a grain of salt from someone who didn't personally experience the earlier eras of the industry, but even a quick look through the discographies of older groups suggests a noticeably different landscape. Full albums were more common, track lists were longer, and releases tended to have more longevity before the next comeback. At one point, it appears to have been relatively normal for groups to spend more time developing the rest of the album. B-sides obviously weren't the central focus of promotions, but they were clearly treated as a meaningful part of the project rather than supplementary filler. So then the question becomes obvious. Why did the industry start treating them like they are? My hypothesis is that the companies did not arbitrarily decide that B-sides were less important. They noticed a shift in how audiences were consuming music and adjusted accordingly. From the first generation of K-pop onwards, each era has reshaped how audiences consume music. The first generation established the idol system itself. Groups created through companies like SM Entertainment built the foundation. Tightly managed idols, coordinated concepts, synchronized choreography, and albums designed around a few recognizable singles. The second generation emerged alongside the rapid growth of social media platforms such as YouTube. Albums became shorter, comeback frequency increased, and repackaged albums became common as a way to extend promotional momentum without producing an entirely new product. Remember when repackaged albums were a thing? Ah, good times. The third generation marked the shift from a primarily domestic market to a global one. Companies began distributing music and content internationally at scale, turning K-pop into a global export. The fourth generation intensified the competition for attention. With the global audience already established, groups focused on differentiation through high-production music videos, intricate choreography, fashion, lore-heavy concepts, and performance spectacle. Visual identity and stage performance became as important as the music itself. Now we arrive at the fifth generation, which appears to be driven primarily by algorithmic visibility. Platforms such as TikTok and Spotify shape how songs are spread, which means releases are increasingly optimized for virality. However, unlike previous eras, the current generation is still difficult to define. There is no consensus on when exactly it began, which groups belong to it, or what its defining characteristics will ultimately be. Earlier generations can be understood in hindsight because their influence has already solidified. The fifth generation is still unfolding, which makes its boundaries and the long-term impact uncertain. But if I personally had to take a guess and speculate as to what will eventually define it, I'd say the core currency of this era is attention economics. At its most basic level, economics revolves around scarcity. People want something, but there isn't enough to go around. Traditionally, in entertainment, that scarcity used to be access. You had to network and sign contracts with record labels to be in the right place at the right time. Social media completely changed that. With the rise of YouTube, for example, it gave everyone a platform and even smaller companies a chance at striking it big. At the same time, as K-pop expanded globally, the number of groups entering the industry exploded. There are new debuts happening all of the time, content is endless, and fans are presented with more idols than they could realistically keep up with. So the scarcity shifted. What's actually limited now is people's attention. And one of the easiest ways I've noticed that idols capture attention today is through relatability. This is certainly not the only way that idols capture attention, however, it is the most pertinent to the discussion I'd like to have today. The idols who gain the most traction with younger audiences are usually the ones who present themselves as culturally aligned with them. Pop culturally, I mean. As we know, idols are infamously silent on anything that could be potentially divisive. Something as little as referencing popular trends or memes can result in that idol being labeled as chronically online even when that is not true. Some examples that come to mind are Kiho from P1 Harmony and Yoonjin from LE SSERAFIM. Fans will then use that familiarity to draw in the blanks. Since we have a tendency to assume the best of those we're fans of, we assume their values and beliefs are also closely aligned. And in an attention economy, that kind of alignment is incredibly valuable. At the same time, idols who deviate from that standard often get treated very differently. When someone feels culturally distant from the audience, the response is usually one of two things. At best, they feel ignored, at worst, they get demonized. An example of this dynamic is the discourse around Annie from All Day Project, especially during the New Year's. I'm not going to get into the exact semantics of how rich this girl is or how rich her family is, because frankly, it doesn't really matter. Attention economics run on narratives, not facts. What matters is that her family is perceived as wealthy enough for certain accusations to exist. Once that perception is there, the narrative writes itself. Whether any of those accusations are true is almost irrelevant once people decide that the story fits. What's interesting is that Annie's image isn't actually that unusual when you compare it to earlier expectations of idols. If anything, she's closer to what used to be normal around the third generation. Maybe this is just me, but I could definitely see someone like her, with her background, totally fitting into Blackpink, for example. Today, though, that deviation creates distance from casual audiences who expect idols to feel like they occupy the same online spaces they do. But that does not mean Annie, or her group, is outside of attention economics, or that they're not reaping the benefits from them. If anything, All Day Project simply represents the opposite extreme. Attention economics doesn't just apply to positive attention, it applies to things such as rage bait and controversy as well. Visibility is visibility. Any publicity is good publicity, etc., etc. Praise spreads in inner circles, but outrage makes headlines. And companies understand this very well. Agencies like YG Entertainment have historically been very good at keeping their artists inside the conversation. For example, when conversations about cultural appropriation were at its height, Lisa was made sure to be wearing braids in Kill This Love. Or even in current day, as there's a gradual shift of not caring about these kinds of social norms, Chaewon is thriving on both the hate he receives and from those who defend him indiscriminately. The same system that now requires constant discourse for relevancy affects idols themselves and the music they create. As I posited before, this is speculation. While there is still a lot uncertain about the fifth generation, what is certain is those tracklist durations. As streaming became the dominant form of music consumption, listener behavior changed. Most people stopped experiencing albums as complete projects and instead interacted with individual songs, usually the one that was already being promoted. From a company's perspective, the data likely made the conclusion obvious. If the overwhelming majority of streams, views, and public attention are concentrated on one song, then it makes more sense to allocate the bulk of production, marketing, and promotional resources towards that one track. In that sense, the industry didn't necessarily devalue B-sides first, the audience did. As I eloquently put it before, the companies simply adjusted accordingly. Older generations of K-pop operated under a slightly different consumption model. Physical album sales were a larger part of the market, promotion cycles were longer, and the release schedule was slower. Under those conditions, it made sense to invest more fully into a tracklist because fans were more likely to engage with the entire product. Whereas in today's climate, it's hard to find people who have actually listened to most groups' songs before making any kind of assessments about them. That is how you end up with people making broad, grandstanding statements about a group's music without having listened to most of their discography. 90% of it, to be exact. And that number, by the way, isn't random. Since I'm most familiar with them, I ended up using Stray Kids, my alt group, as an example. Stray Kids has developed a reputation among casual listeners for being the noisy group or the loud group. That being said, Stray Kids have roughly 22 title tracks across their career, but their overall catalog sits around 220 total songs when you include all of their B-sides, unit tracks, special releases, and yes, even soundtrack contributions. And so with doing a little bit of math, that means that the title tracks make up about 10% of their discography. In other words, when someone forms an opinion about Stray Kids' music purely from their title tracks, they are evaluating the group based on 1/10 of the music they've actually released. And of course, this doesn't just apply to Stray Kids, this applies to all groups. This is how K-pop groups gets kinda stuffed into a certain concept, sound, or look very quickly if their title tracks happen to coincide a little bit too closely with one another. However, even then, I'm not done. Because I think while anyone can look at the number and say, hey, it's probably not the best idea to look at 10% of an artist's discography and make really broad assessments about their music, I also don't think it's necessary to listen to 100% of songs. I think that after you listen to enough of an artist's music, and you're not necessarily trying to be a completionist about it, I think you can have a rough idea of what kind of music a group makes. And so that is kind of the last idea I want to leave off with as I close out this video, because I don't have an answer, and I have a really big suspicion that this is going to be different for everybody. So I'm just going to be throwing it out to you guys since this video is already quite long, especially for the type of videos I usually make. This is truly something that's subjective and is going to change from person to person, but I'm curious to see what the general consensus will be in the comment section. I think for me personally, I would say that maybe 25% of a group's discography maybe you should listen to really get an idea of what they make. 50% feels a little bit too much because depending on the group, that could be a lot of songs. But I think 25% really hits that sweet spot because I know some K-pop groups can also be a bit repetitive. So hoping to kind of counteract that or alleviate that, I'm hoping to kind of skip the songs that are a bit too similar to one another. Anyway, that'll be it from me for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye!